Good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching. Afreilichen Chanukah, Chanukah Sameach, to those who are still in this time zone and are basking in the final glow of our Chanukah Menorah in the uplifting and empowering days of Chanukah. Today I want to share with you reflections as Chanukah Tavshin Pei Vav, Chanukah 5786 draws to a close. For verily, it has been a most extraordinary Chanukah, most unusual Chanukah. Perhaps not like any other Chanukah we have experienced in living memory. And in some ways, I think that this year's Chanukah observance and celebration is perhaps unique even in Jewish history. To the best of my knowledge, never before has the Jewish community, the global Jewish community, began Chanukah with such heartbrokenness, with such sadness, with such darkness. It's only in the last few decades that the global Jewish community is so united, that everything is communicated in real time. Chanukah arrives in the continent or country of Australia first. And before Chanukah arrived, the devastating events unfolded on Bondi Beach. Thousands of Jews who had gathered to light the Menorah, to usher in Chanukah, were attacked by demonic terrorists. Everybody knows what happened. There's no reason for me to repeat the details. Of course, the news spread like wildfire, and there wasn't a Jew in the world who didn't enter Chanukah with a very, very heavy heart. Besides the personal grief that all of us felt and shared, there were big questions that had to be answered. Some of us voiced these questions, some of us just thought about these questions. How was Chanukah going to be celebrated this year? How could you celebrate Chanukah this year? After all, Chanukah is a public mitzvah. As the Gemara tells us, and this is in Masechet Shabbat on Daf Chaf Aleph, Amud Beis, page 21b, our rabbis taught us, mitzvahs Chanukah, the mitzvah. A mitzvah is a commandment. A mitzvah is also a mechanism through which we are able to nurture connectivity with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a vehicle, a nexus, for us to be able to nurture our special relationship with God. The mitzvah of Chanukah, the obligation, the responsibility, the privilege, is Neir Ish Ubeisei. It is, organically speaking, if you strip it down to its bare essence, it's the candle, it's the lamp, it's the flame of the man in his home. That's the literal words of the Gemara. V'mahadrin, if one is to perform this mitzvah in a meticulous and beautiful fashion, Ner l'chol echad v'echad, then it would be one lamp. They didn't have candles in antiquity. They used small containers with olive oil and a little wick inside. One lamp would be lit for each member of the household. V'hamahadrin, min hamahadrin. And what if somebody wanted to be most meticulous about observing the mitzvah of Chanukah? So there we get into a dispute of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. It's on a changing scale. Every day a different amount of lamps or lights would be lit. And of course, this gives rise to the proverbial Chanukah Menorah, in modern times referred to as a Chanukah, although that's a modern word. It's a Chanukah Menorah. It's a menorah in the image of the Beit HaMikdash. Minhag Yisrael is not simply to place a lamp or a candle, but rather, Minhag Yisrael is to have a menorah that begins in our iteration of the observance of Chanukah with one flame on the first night, and then we continue to add, as the proverbial expression goes, meisiv v'hilach, continuing to add on a regular basis. So it's a personal mitzvah. It's a personal mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that requires a residence or a home. The question, however, is where is that menorah supposed to be placed? Whilst it's the mitzvah that requires a home or a residence, where in the residence should we best place these lamps, flames, or candles? So the Gemara a little bit later on addresses this issue. And the Gemara says, Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned, Ner Chanukah, the lamp of Chanukah, mitzvah, the best way or the right way, the appropriate way to fulfill this, the instructed fashion, is lahanicha al pesach beito mibachutz, to place it at the door of your residence, the door of your residence that leads to the public thoroughfare, to the outdoors. Now, where precisely is this? So Rashi tells us that the reason it has to be mibachutz is mishum parsume nisa. This is a concept that is not found in any other observance of Judaism, not in any of the 613 biblical mitzvahs or the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. In all 620 dimensions of our multifaceted and unique relationship with God, nowhere do we have this emphasis on parsume nisa, publicizing the miracle to the point that it has to be placed in a public thoroughfare. So Rashi says, it's not really bereshus harabim, it's not the public thoroughfare per se. It's referring to the courtyard. It's a semi-private. In ancient times, and you can still see very old cities built this way. In fact, if you visit Yerushalayim, you can go through the narrow streets of Yerushalayim. You see this very much in the area known as the Armenian Quarter, where the people live in these enclaves. There are lots of homes that empty into a common courtyard, and then there is a door that locks, and only people who live in this area are able to come into the courtyard, which is shared by the residents. So Rashi seems to say that the Pesach Beisai, that the outer door refers to the door of your specific dwelling. So Parsume Nisa means for your neighbors, for those close to you. It should be noted that the Tosfos, as well as the Tosfos Rid, and many of the other Rishonim disagree with Rashi. And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch seems to follow their approach. Rashi tells us it means not necessarily the outer thoroughfare, but your personal doorway, your entranceway. But the Tosfos says, Umayri, this only refers to a situation of the leka, chotzer, ella, bayis, eimid, samach l'reshus harabim. That's if your door opens directly into a public thoroughfare. Avlam yesh chotzer l'fnei habayis. If the private residences open into a communal area, which is semi-private, so then your mitzvah, the mitzvah is lahaniach al petach chatzer. Then it is to place the menorah not at your personal residence, but on the outer door. Now think about this. That would mean that your family wouldn't even see the menorah, because the menorah would be lit on the outside. And they're kind of inside the walls, inside the door, inside their own homes. So perhaps everybody would gather for the kindling of the menorah, but the flames of the menorah, as they continued to flicker and burn as dusk would fall, this was something that was seen by the public thoroughfare. And Tosfos tells us that this is actually what we should be doing. And then he queries, what do you do if you have a chotzer sheyesh lo beis psachim? What do you have? A courtyard that has 2 entranceways. And he says, in that case, you should place a menorah at each of them. So it's a very public mitzvah. On one hand, it's a private mitzvah, it's a personal mitzvah. We have to light menorahs in our own homes. You have to have a home to be able to light a menorah. And at the same time, the menorah's calling is extremely public. The Gemara says, what if you don't have a doorway that opens to the public thoroughfare? Perhaps you live on the 2nd floor. There were no skyscrapers in antiquity, but people lived on homes that maybe were 2-story or 3-story dwellings. So the Gemara says, then you place it at a window, the opening of the window, which is smucha l'reshus harabim. And then the Gemara says, ubeshas hasakana, at a time of danger, manicha al shulchanoi v'dayoy. Then the menorah is placed upon the table, and that is sufficient. In other words, that there are 2 dimensions to this mitzvah. On one hand, it's a personal mitzvah, ner ishu beito. On the other hand, the placement of the candle that is about, or the lamp about to be kindled, should be in a public place. But the latter dimension is not immutable. If you can only fulfill the first, you are still fulfilling the mitzvah of Chanukah. Incidentally, in the Code of Jewish Law in the Shulchan Aruch, it says very, very clearly, and this is in Siman Tafresh Ayin Aleph, chapter 671 of the Shulchan Aruch, Im yesh chotzer lefnei habayit, if there's a chotzer, a courtyard outside the home, anicha el pesach chotzer, you have to place it in the most public of locations, near the public thoroughfare, where the traffic is constantly going, with this pedestrian traffic. And if dor ba'aliyah, you place it in the window. Ubashas hasakona, at a time of danger, she'ein rashai lekayim ha-mitzvah, that you are not able to fulfill the mitzvah in its fullest sense, meaning the element of the mitzvah, the dimension of the mitzvah that calls for publicity cannot be fulfilled because there's danger. In that case, manichei al shulchanai v'dayer. And so there were voices, many voices, that suggested that perhaps public menorah lightings had to be canceled. Perhaps we had to recede back into the shadows. Perhaps Jewish people had to take cover, circle the wagons, observe Chanukah in our own homes, but avoid the publicity because we were exposing ourselves to danger. One man even approached me with the Gemara in hand, arguing that we should cancel our public menorah lightings, saying to me that in fact I was choosing to place our community in a position of danger. Needless to say, I knew that he was wrong in my heart before I even opened the Gemara. But I challenge this individual, and I want to share this with you because it is critically important that we all understand that our behavior is guided by Torah and Torah alone. And by virtue of finding the answer to this question, it also became very clear to me that the time in which we live is challenging, but it is not the time for us to go underground. Not at all. Okay, so what is the meaning of B'shas HaSakona? Rashi tells us, HaSakona, Shahaya lahem leparsiim, that there were for these Persians, Chok b'yom Edam. They had a statute on the time when they would celebrate their holiday, Shaloi yaviru ner elo bebeit avodah zarah shalahem, that all fire had to be kindled in their temples, which was a religion that is foreign to Judaism. Kidamrin begitten, as it says in the Gemara in Masechet Gittin. Allow me to share with you the words of the Tosfos before I go on to putting this into modern English. The Tosfos says, Niralari, Rabbeinu Yitzchak maintained, Dahainu, Mechiasu Chavri leBavel. This refers to the times that the Chavri came to Bavel. As we say in Perek Kira, which is in this very Masechet Shabbat later on page 45. The Gemara queries, Mahu letaltal shraga, the Chanukah mekame chavri. May one lift the container, the lamp that was used for Chanukah? May one use that, lift it once the candle has already been extinguished, once the flame has burnt itself out. May you move it on Shabbat? What's the question? So there's a concept of something called a basis l'davar ha'aser, which means that once something is used for a non-permitted purpose on Shabbat, for example, lifting a flame that's burning, we're not allowed to lift a flame or handle fire on Shabbat, and the reason is that it might be extinguished on Shabbat, and that's a violation of the Torah. We're not allowed to kindle or extinguish fire on Shabbat. So in that case, then the lamp remains prohibited even after the candle or fire has burnt out. We would have a similar example with a candlestick today. Obviously, you cannot handle the Shabbat candlesticks on Friday night, but could you move them off the table on Shabbat morning? And the simple answer would be no, because they are basis l'davar ha'aser. They were used over the course of the entrance of Shabbat to house or contain a flame, and they weren't allowed to be moved. That once it can't be moved at the onset of Shabbat, you're not permitted to move it afterwards either. And there's other reasons as to why that might be muktzah, why that might be beyond the bounds of movement on Shabbat. But let's stay focused on Chanukah now. So the Gemara says that there's this question that's asked later on, can you move the lamp after it has burnt out? Why would you want to do that? And the answer is, mikame chavre, because the chavri might come. And if the chavri would see that you lit a lamp on Chanukah, you might get yourself into trouble. So would the rabbinic prohibition of muktzah, of not moving certain things on Shabbat, so as to add a layer of respect and awe and cherishment for Shabbos, would that be lifted because there's a danger? The chavre could persecute you for having lit a candle or have a lamp being burning in your home that wasn't connected to their particular temple. So that's how Tosfos proves this point, that this is speaking about the chavre. So he kind of elaborates the words of Rashi. He's talking about the chavre. And then the Tosfos asks a question. He says, I don't understand. If that's the issue, if that's the problem, how's it going to help to place it on your table? If it's going to be on the table, they'd also confiscate it and maybe even persecute the individuals who had violated their laws. And we see this in the Gemara in Masechet Gittin on page 17, that there's a story with Rabbi Bar Bachana Cholash, that he was in a weakened state. Also Chavra, there was a member of this Chavra cult which came. Shakol Shaga Mekamayu, he took away his lamp, he confiscated his lamp. And the Tosfos says, V'yesh leimar, the ein regilis kokach lechapes shebatim. They don't really go through homes searching. If you place it at your door, if you place it in your window, expect the authorities to show up. But if it's inside, then it wouldn't be an issue. Others maintain that in addition to this, if it's on your table, what's to say that it's a mitzvah lamp? It could just be a lamp that's used for the purpose of, having dinner. Now, in the commentary of Rabbeinu Nissim in the Ran, he's more explicit about this. He says, "Ubeshas hasakona" means shegozru al hamitzvos. Beshas hasakona means that they made a decree so as not to observe mitzvot. And not to observe mitzvot means that ultimately, did I just lose everybody? No. That ultimately, this was a question of the authorities outlawing Yiddishkeit itself. And that's when Manicha al shulchan. And the Ran says, and the man the chazi, a person who will see this, savar hay ner lav mitzvah. This is not it didn't look like a menorah. Chanukah menorahs were not so common. It could just be a lamp. So ela neira, it might be his personal lamp. So who are these chavri? Who are these people? So Rav Adin Even Yisrael Zechein Levracha in the Steinsaltz edition of Talmud suggests the following: the dangerous times, and I quote, are defined as periods of religious persecution, when it is decreed that Jewish people may not observe the mitzvot. Some of the commentaries explain that the dangerous times in this context are the occasions when the Zoroastrian priests of the Persian fire religion, who are called chavarim, passed fire from their temple to the homes of their worshippers. And at those times, they prohibited lighting fires anywhere outside the temple. Now, Rav Adin is citing the Tosfos here. And he adds, since the Chavarim had significant influence on the authorities, and the violators whom they reported were severely punished, the Jews dare not kindle lights that could be seen from the street. Now, this is not to be confused with today's Zoroastrians, very, very peaceful people, fine people, mostly centered in Persia. But it seems that in antiquity, some of these Zoroastrian priests were extremely aggressive. And, by the way, why does Rashi seem to say it's B'yom Edom? It's on the day of their festival. So I did a little research, and it turns out that the ancient Zoroastrians had a holiday celebrated on December 25th, long before the rise of Christianity. In fact, they still celebrate this holiday. The Persian Zoroastrians, I believe, celebrate the holiday, and they call it Yalda. And if I'm not mistaken, they just celebrated this holiday 2 days ago. So it comes at approximately December 25th or so. And I think their calendar is a little bit different than the calendar, than the Gregorian calendar. And the bottom line is that there were times that Chanukah would overlap. So whether we understand this as Rashi and Tosfos seem to understand this, that this refers to the Zoroastrian period, in which time the Jewish people were not permitted or unable to perform the mitzvah because there was official persecution, or whether it is because religious persecution was outlawed altogether, the bottom line is that ultimately we speak here about nothing short of religious persecution. Shas HaSakana does not mean a time when there are radical terrorists who roam the streets. It means a time when government has formally outlawed religion. In modern terminology, we're talking about Nazism, we're talking about communism. We are not talking about the time in which we currently live. So let's be clear about this. We are living in a time of great challenge. There are very, very dangerous group of people. Sorry about this. We're still here? Okay. So, to those who say that now we're living in a time of danger, to those who say that it's time to take the Chanukah menorah indoors, your proof from the Gemara is not only insufficient, but is entirely misguided and simply wrong. So in the Warsaw Ghetto, if the Nazis outlaw the kindling of a menorah, yes, you take it into your basement or in the privacy of whatever space residence you had, and that's where you lit the menorah instead of doing it in the window or the door. When the communists forbade the observance of religion on the pain of death, yes, you brought your menorah indoors and you didn't open your door or share it with your neighbors. We are not living in a time like this. Even politicians whose reticent leadership leaves much to be desired, even politicians who are entirely misguided in making the tragic mistake that the reason that there isn't peace in the Middle East and that the reason that there are people who hate Jews in a violent way and wish to harm us is because there isn't a Palestinian state, and that is misguided and it is historically inaccurate. And there was nobody agitating for a Palestinian state before 1967, even though Egypt was occupying Gaza, and there was no such thing as a Palestinian state. And Jordan was occupying the proverbial West Bank, and there was no such thing as a Palestinian state. And nobody had an issue and a problem. And yet the terrorists were murdering Jews. Not once and not twice. And in 1929, Israel wasn't a Jewish state at all. And Jews were hacked to pieces and brutally murdered. And the list goes on. So it is a profoundly tragic, misguided mistake. And yes, perhaps it takes a little bit of bias for otherwise intelligent people to be this misguided. But these very same people are all saying clearly and loudly that they reject anti-Semitism. In fact, everybody saw what happened in Australia yesterday. There was an incredible event on the last night of Chanukah, and the very Prime Minister, whose dangerous positions seems to have directly enabled these demonic terrorists, the horrible hate marches that filled the streets in Sydney, which eventually led to the disaster and the tragedy and the catastrophe of Chanukah 2025 in Bondi Beach. He himself came to the menorah lighting. Now, he was booed, and I'm not suggesting that that's inappropriate. What I am saying is that despite the fact that we, the Jewish community, are deeply offended and angered by the behavior of certain politicians, the Prime Minister of my country is no different, unfortunately. He still made a point of coming to a menorah lighting on the first night of Hanukkah. Whether he should have been welcomed is another question, but the fact is he did. And he has condemned anti-Semitism. In his twisted mind, he somehow thinks you can demonize Israel, and you can promote the blood libels, which are reminiscent of the blood libels that were promoted during the Middle Ages against the Jewish people, because now Israel has become the Jew amongst the nations. So in his misguided way, he has created this false narrative where hatred for Israel, the state, is not equated with hatred for Israel, the people. Of course, the evidence on the ground tells us otherwise. These monsters who claim to be against Israel or claim to be against Zionism ultimately hate every single Jew, and they say it openly. Their desire, Rachmana litzlan, is lahashmid, lahareg, ula'abed. And I'm using the Hebrew words of the Megillah that speak about eradication and genocide. That's what they want. And as Haman had his downfall, they will have their downfall. And they will be destroyed as all of our enemies who have come before. But we're not living in a shasa sakana, my friends. It's like, get a grip on yourself. We are not living in a dangerous time. That doesn't mean there isn't danger. So we have an obligation. We have an obligation to secure our menorah lightings. We have an obligation to work with local law enforcement when we are able, and here in the city of Vaughan, we are blessed with an extraordinary mayor, an extraordinary city council, and an extraordinary police force who believe that Jewish people should have the same rights as every other citizen of Canada, who know that 0.5% of the country is suffering 70% of the hate crimes. So you do the simple arithmetic. This is a community that now needs to be protected. And Baruch Hashem, they rolled their sleeves up. And they really, really have done a great deal to ensure our safety and security. I'm not suggesting that we don't take the precautions. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't, for a moment, stop lobbying the politicians who, in their misguided and twisted approach, are harming and endangering Jewish people everywhere. I am stating clearly and unequivocally that these are not classic anti-Semites in the Nazi or Stalinist sense. And we are not living in a shasa sakana. We are living in a free society, in a time of unprecedented opportunity, and the menorah belongs in the outdoors. Because the mitzvah is lahanichei al pesach beisim mibachutz. Our sages tell us that when the Jewish people go to war, one of the worst things that could possibly happen is when the soldiers begin to flee. In fact, when the Jewish people went to war, there were cruel soldiers who manned the area behind the front lines. And if there was somebody who ran from the front, they had permission even to chop his legs off. Sounds very harsh. But the Gemara tells us, Tchilas nefila nisa. The great fall begins when you flee. Chas v'shalom, that the Jewish people should bow their heads in shame. Chas v'shalom, that we should go underground. Heaven forfend that we should hide our Judaism. There is once a year, that the Torah calls upon us to loudly and proudly broadcast a message of our eternity and of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's miracles. And that is during the week of Chanukah. And as such, our mitzvah is al Pesach Beisei. Our mitzvah is in the public square. Our mitzvah is in the public thoroughfare. Now, over time, especially during the course of the Middle Ages, it became virtually impossible for Jewish people to fulfill the mitzvah of Chanukah in its classical sense. We simply couldn't. It was too dangerous. Governments, armies, police forces were arraigned against us, doing everything they could to stamp out our flame and our Yiddishkeit. So we did the best we could under the circumstances. And during a certain period, and this is beyond the purview of this class, Be'ezrat Hashem, at a different time I will address this in greater detail, but during a certain period, we moved from simply Ner Ishu Beito to a new concept in Chanukah, and it was called Takanat Beit HaKnesset. That because the publicity element of Chanukah had become lost, because we had have no choice but to retreat indoors, that the publicity element of Chanukah should still be celebrated by virtue of kindling a menorah in a public place where nobody would fulfill the personal mitzvah. Much like Kiddush that's recited in certain Batei Knesiot, even though nobody actually remains to eat. So what are you making blessings for? But this is a very long and detailed subject, bli neder, for a different time. The Rebbe understood that living in a free time now, the concept of Takanat Beit HaKnesset, that the idea of publicity meant public menorah lightings. That we would have the opportunity to be able to broadcast our message far and wide. And clearly, the menorah's light was not meant only for Jewish people. In fact, the very same Gemara queries, so what is the proper time for the kindling of the menorah? When is it that the menorah should best be lit? And the language that the Gemara uses is Mishetishka hachama, from the time that the sun sets, Achetich regel min hashuk, until the traffic in the marketplace ceases. And the Gemara queries, what is the meaning of Achetich regel min hashuk? Which traffic are we speaking about? The end of rush hour? The end of people going all together? What does this mean? The concept of the end of public thoroughfare or traffic. And the Gemara answers, Omer Rabba bar Chana, Omer Rabbi Yochanan, Adekalya rigla de Tamudai, until the traffic of the people of Tadmor or Talmudoi ceases. And these are the people, as Rashi sold us, that they sold kindling wood, and they would be in the marketplace long after anybody else would. Because sometimes people would go home and discover that they had exhausted their supply of kindling wood or fire, ability to warm the home, so they come back to the marketplace, and that's where the Talmudoi would go. And there's a lot to say about the Talmudoi. I actually delivered a class on this previously. You can go to the Love Lights Hanukkah, and you'll find details of who these Palmyrans were. There's a misnomer that sends them off to Palmyra in Syria. It's talking about a group of people who lived in the land of Israel, and they were not Jewish. In fact, in the Sefer Emek HaMelech, it tells clearly that the word Talmudoi, as Rashi says, it's a ummah, it's a nation, not simply named after the vocation of kindling wood or kindling fire, according to some Rishonim, but rather it refers to a nation of people, according to some who are poor, and a nation of people that the Emek HaMelech says can be reconfigured to spell the word murderous, rebellion, a seditious, rebellious people. The Rebbe suggests that the idea of ani, the idea of poverty, is in line with the teaching of our sages in ani ela bedas. When you say that a person is impoverished, we're not speaking about their financial situation. We're speaking about how they view themselves, whether a person sees himself as empty, as destitute, whether a person's mind is poor. Poverty is a state of being. Poverty is a state of mind. People who had no meaning to life, no purpose to life. People who lived a nihilistic existence. They too have to see the light of the menorah. In other words, as the Rebbe would point out in many of his talks, both edited and unedited, that the concept of Chanukah belongs in the public thoroughfare. It belongs in the public thoroughfare, and it's to be kindled when it is dark outside. The public thoroughfare in a geographic sense, at the outside of your courtyard, where traffic, public traffic, pedestrian traffic that is not necessarily familial or even part of our nation, where they are. Within time, we're talking about a dark time. And within people, we're talking about the lowest form of civilization. Olam Shana Nefesh, a famous concept talked about in the writings of the mystics. Space, time, and soul. In each, Chanukah addresses the outer reaches of our personal space, the personal space that is accessible by the public, at the time when it is dark and you could add cold outside, and seeking to engage the lowest level, most seditious kinds of people. That's the message of Chanukah. When things get dark and difficult, when we have hate in the street against us, it is not a time for us to retreat from the street. Now is the time when the Chanukah menorah has to be kindled brightest. Now is the time when the menorah has to shine brightest. The necessary precautions? Well, of course. Lobbying governments? Absolutely. Ensuring the safety and security of the community and members of Am Yisrael? There's no question. But to retreat? To run away? To be concerned that if we will rise or raise our heads with a sense of pride, that this will endanger us? The exact opposite is true. If we retreat and if we run away, then we are giving evil victory. And the more we recede and the more we retreat, the more it encroaches. So we knew. All Chabad rabbis and rebbes around the world knew that this would be a year of Chanukah where we would have to try even harder, promote public menorah lightings even more vigorously. Of course we would. This is the way the Rebbe taught us. You have to know that the Rebbe really reinvented Chanukah, if you will. He showed us that the idea of the public thoroughfare is not simply the Beit HaKnesset, but in modern free times when we're able to reach the Tarmudoi, the outer world, that we had opportunity now in this wonderful age of freedom and liberty to kindle our menorahs everywhere and anywhere. And it's caught on like wildfire. You know, initially, the Lubavitch movement was met with stiff opposition. And it was almost hard to understand the Rebbe's very, very forceful approach. The Rebbe said, we are going to do this, and we should go to court. And the Rebbe encouraged the shluchim to take it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. This is all well documented and quite fascinating. But beyond the purview of this presentation, the point I want to make to you is that this is a decidedly Chabad Lubavitch project. Nobody ever did this before. And it's hard for me to imagine that anybody is actually convincing themselves otherwise. I saw a fascinating post on social media. So I just printed it out because I found it so interesting. It was from a person who, it seems to me, is not Chabad at all. And I did a little bit of research quickly just to see. The fellow's name is Michael Broide. He says, and I'm quoting him, I came across this post by Michal Biton and felt that she captured something so many of us are feeling right now. It's worth reading in full. Quote, I'm not Chabad, but this week I've kept thinking, thank God for the Rebbe. Thank God for Chabad. The confidence many of us carry today to respond to anti-Semitism with Jewish presence rather than retreat, to light candles after terror rather than to hide, didn't come out of nowhere. It was cultivated, fought for, taught more than anyone else by the Lubavitcher Rebbe and his shluchim. I wrote on my Substack this week about how the Rebbe transformed Chanukah and why so many of us, whether we realize it or not, are living inside that legacy. He goes on to write, when we be inspired, may we live inspired by the Rebbe's Torah of Jewish pride, by the memory of the 15 Jews who were murdered at Bondi Beach, including Rabbi Eli Schlenger, Hashem Yikavdom of the Chabad rabbi, who was helping bring Jews together there. May their memories be a blessing. He wrote, grateful for voices that help put words to this moment and remind us of the power of Jewish presence and light. How right he is. How right he is. And that's exactly what's gone on over the course of this week. Chabad rabbis and rebbitzin have risen to the occasion like lions, like never before. Had the menorah lighting, public menorah lightings, been attended by all kinds of people. And here, I want to share with you something which I think is positively fascinating. It's not a secret that there is a Hasidic discourse that the Rebbe edited and distributed just days before he fell ill with a devastating stroke in 1992. The Maimer, the Hasidic discourse, is regarded by many, Hasidim, acolytes, followers, disciples, and even well-wishers of Chabad, as sort of a last will and testament, marching orders from the Rebbe. The Maimer begins with the word, V'ata tetzava es b'nei Yisrael, and you will command the Jewish people. You are referring to Moshe Rabbeinu. This is a verse which is found, of course, in the beginning of Parshat Tetzaveh, and it is a verse that speaks about the need for Moshe Rabbeinu to take the olive oil, Shemen Zayit Zoch, the olive oil that is crushed for the purpose of illumination, Lamoyer, Lahales Ner Tamid. And in the Maimer, the Rebbe goes on to elaborate on the details of this Maimer. And of course, we're speaking about the kindling of the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. It's a fascinating rumination. I have actually an online series on the entirety of the Maimer, and I encourage all of you to study this Maimer. It's a foundational rumination and teaching of the Rebbe. I want to share with you a few salient points here. The mimer is centered around a mimer delivered by the previous Rebbe on the minor Purim. In a Jewish leap year, you have 2 Adars, so Adar the first becomes a minor Purim. And it's all about olive oil. I mean, Purim is about wine. That's the beverage of Purim. But this mimer is not about wine. It's about olive oil. It's about the menorah. It's about kindling the flames. In the mimer, the Rebbe speaks about the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not mentioned. And he said that the essence of Moshe, in an essence which is larger than life and larger than physical presence, is the concept of Moshe Rabbeinu's mission, namely titzaveh. The word titzaveh is a permutation of the Hebrew word which means connection. The job of Moshe Rabbeinu is to connect the Jewish people to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And how does this kind of dovetail into the business with the crushed olives and the oil that emerges from the olives being pulverized? And so in the Maimer he goes on to explain that when there is a squeeze and difficult circumstances, and we find ourselves engulfed and threatened with enemies trying to overwhelm us, not only does it not make us weak, on the contrary, that the pressure that they place upon us enables us to discover our source of energy, our spiritual oil. And with that, we kindle our souls, which radiate and glow brightly. And then the Rebbe says an incredible thing in this mimer. The Rebbe says, Yedua, it is known that the Mesiras Nefesh, that the sacrifice that was exhibited bepoil, not in theory, actual sacrifice. Sacrifice means to do something that you don't feel comfortable doing or want to do, but you do it because you believe and know that it is right. And there are some things that are worth making a sacrifice for. The Mesiras Nefesh bepoil al Torah mitzvah shel kol Yisrael, for all of the Jewish people, was in the time of Purim. And the Rebbe goes on in this mimer to say, this is in Ois Zayin, in chapter 7 of the mimer, Bizman Gzeres Haman, in the time of the Gzeres Haman, because in the Mesiras Nefesh of Chanukah, in the time of the Gzeres Yavan, there was Mesiras Nefesh. There was great sacrifice, but the sacrifice was exhibited by Matisyahu Ubanov, by the high priest, by the clerisy of the Jewish people. This upper crust of Maccabean devotion, the Hasmonean family who joined forces together with the family of the Kohen Gadol, Chashmana Yuvanov, who came together with Matisyahu Kohen Gadol. They had sacrifice. The Rebbe says in the time of Gzeres Haman, the Mesiras Nefesh was B'chol Yisrael. It wasn't for the leadership. It wasn't for the pious or those inspired. Everybody exhibited the Mesiras Nefesh. And here he goes on to speak about the Medrash that likens Mordechai to Moshe Rabbeinu. That Mordechai serves the same function and is in some way equal to Moshe Rabbeinu, to Moses himself. A Moses in his time, to quote the Zohar. Because ispashtusa de Moshe, there's an extension of Moshe. There's a continuation, a continuity of the spirit, the legacy of Moshe Rabbeinu. And indeed, Mordechai is like Moshe. The Rebbe says that Mordechai, who was the leader of the Jewish people, Mordechai, who inspired the whole nation, he was the Raya Mehemna, he was the shepherd of faith. He nurtured the faith within the people. He enabled them to reveal the deepest rhythm of their connection to the Almighty, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for all the Jewish people. And this is like Moshe Rabbeinu, who by virtue of his Torah teaching and his inspired leadership and spiritual charisma was able to kindle the souls of all the Jewish people of his day. So with Moshe Rabbeinu, it was the virtue of him giving a sense of clarity, focusing the Jewish people onto who they were and what potential Hashem had endowed them with. He was Mashpia Das. But in Mordechai's time, Mordechai was able to inspire the Jewish people in his way, and he brought the Jewish people together. 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 And he brought And the Rebbe goes on to say that in some way the Frierdiker Rebbe, by articulating this teaching, is actually inadvertently, like subconsciously commenting on his own behavior. What this means in simple terminology is that the Lubavitch movement, whilst it was always committed to service, was primarily about Hafatzas Hamayonos, responsible for promulgating the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, the teachings of Hasidus. But in the time of the previous Rebbe, under the jackboot of communism, there was no rabbinic leadership left in the Soviet Union. There was simply nobody to pick up the mantle of Yiddishkeit, not Hasidus. There was nobody to build a mikveh. There was nobody to teach Jewish children. There was nobody to be a shochet, a ritual slaughterer, or run a shul. Only the Hasidim were able to maintain their faith under that fire, under that fury. I know this personally, because my great-grandfather didn't come from a Chabad background at all. And when he sent my Zayda Alav Shalom, when he sent him to study Torah in the secret schools, the network of secret schools that the previous Rebbe operated, he said, I can see clearly there will be no Jews left, save the Hasidim. And he himself ended up becoming a Chassid and paid for his devotion to Yiddishkeit with his life. Such was the story at that time. But how did Mordechai inspire the people? How did the Frierdiker Rebbe inflame the hearts, minds, and souls of Soviet Jewry? Mordechai did this, and it says earlier in the Maimer, and this is in Ois Dalet of the Maimer, that in general, Galut is a time in which we have challenges, nisyonot, tests. It's difficult to fulfill our legacy, our calling of the study of Torah and performance of mitzvot. And the nature of Galut is such that it's just under so much pressure, we find ourselves maybe overwhelmed, inundated, imploding, unable to stand up to the difficulties of the hour. And the Rebbe says you can only imagine how difficult things were in the time of Gzerat Haman. And yet, despite the fact that things were so difficult at that time, the Talmud tells us that the fulfillment of Torah comes specifically in that time. That's the real acceptance of the Torah. The real commitment to Torah comes then. And the Rebbe explains in this Maimer that in the time of the Gzeira, people fulfilled mitzvot under duress, and they were ready to make a sacrifice. The sacrifice came in the form shalei lichber, not to deny your Jewishness. Yes, simply to identify as a Jew. Because, as the Alter Rebbe brings in the Maimer in Torah, or this is brought from earlier sources, medieval sources, that if the Jewish people had abandoned their Jewish identity, then the enemies of the Jewish people would have welcomed them. They were only against the Zionists. They were only against those who identified with Torah values. They were only against those who refused to bow their heads in submission and allow themselves to be defined by those who hate our heritage and our legacy. The Gezeidah was only on Yehudim, only on those who walked with their heads held high, only with those who refused to give in or stop acknowledging HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Gezeidah was on everybody. And Afal Pikinli also al daita machshavas chutz. The rank and file of the Jewish people did not cave. They had Mesiras Nefesh. And here is something so key, so critical. This was pointed out to me by a shliach right here in Toronto, Rabbi Moshe Steiner. I know many people have already taken what he wrote and claimed paternity, but he's the first one, to the best of my knowledge, who zeroed in on this line in the Maimer. Va'ad she'ekilu kehilos berabim. Till such a point that Mordechai gathered the crowds. He gathered the people together to teach them Torah. And the hitorerut, the awakening of the Mesiras Nefesh, was through Mordechai HaYehudi, the Moshe of his generation, Who rallied the Jewish people over the course of the last week? The Gemara tells us, shluchim shel adam kamoisei. The agent or emissary of a sender is like the sender himself. As the Rebbe once said about the shluchim, that he wanted to be there to serve, to help, to minister to every single member of Am Yisrael everywhere in the world, but a human being can only be in one place and at one time. And the Rebbe verbalized and articulated himself and said that the shluchim would become his extended hands. Today, there are well over 6,000 families, shluchim families, of rabbis and rebbitzins and their children. Who inspired the people to come out? Who arranged all those public menorah lightings? Who gave the people the fortitude, the courage, the spiritual strength to stand up and be counted? Last night, a woman came over to me at the menorah lighting that we had in a public thoroughfare, and she said to me, I was so scared to come tonight. I'm so afraid of being attacked in public. We're living in Toronto. She's afraid to be Jewish in public. She said, but you encouraged me, and that is what inspired me to be here today. I thought to myself, wow, who encouraged her? What do I know? I just have the privilege of being a shlich of the Rebbe. And by virtue of passing on the Rebbe's words, I'm able to encourage people to stand loud and proud and tall, identifying Jewishly in a time when we know that there's a target on our backs. Not simple stuff. So many amazing things happened over the course of this Chanukah. A Chanukah that began with such difficult darkness. A Chanukah that began with such sadness, but saw the Jewish people around the world rally. They rallied around public menorahs. They rallied around Chanukah. They articulated and expressed their deepest sentiments of Jewish pride, Jewish connectivity, and Jewish love, loyalty, and devotion to Hashem. So many unusual things have happened over the course of this week, just in my own personal capacity, and I'm one of thousands of shluchim. After a particularly well-attended and moving menorah lighting at our city hall, our member of parliament, Melissa Lantzman, sent me the following. After speaking about how unique the address was and the event in and of itself was, she wrote, and I want to quote her with her permission, "This Chanukah might finally be the answer to why public menorah lightings became such a central mission for Chabad. For a long time, I don't think I fully understood it. Today," she wrote, "I do. I know intellectually that the menorah is not meant to be hidden away. I understand the mitzvah, parsume nisa, to make the miracle public. But what I never got is that the light isn't just for ourselves. It's meant to be seen, especially when darkness feels loud and confident." It's sad. This year, the public menorah isn't about ceremony or symbolism. It's about presence. It's about refusing to retreat, refusing to dim who we are, and insisting that Jewish life belongs openly in the public square. Tonight made something click for me. That light isn't lit because the world is safe. It's lit because it isn't. And that may be the most Jewish answer of all. Unfortunately, it took a horrible tragedy to make it click. And it's that part that tells me I need to do more. Wow. Just before Shabbos, my wife pointed out that a young lady out of Australia named Sarah Chana Safran had posted on Facebook, and she wrote that she'd been quiet all week because there were no words adequate to describe the horror and the pain, the devastation and the heartbreak. No words sufficient for the heroism and the selflessness of those who put themselves in harm's way to help and save others, with some paying the ultimate price, their own lives. No words that can make sense of the insensible, no words that could explain the unfathomable, no words that can reconcile our crushing grief at the loss of those we hold near and dear, our rage at those who perpetrated these heinous acts, our disbelief that this is actually happening in our beloved sunny Australia, our bitter and indignant anger with those in government whose actions and inactions, despite every warning, led to this, and our surrender to Hashem, who's ultimately in control. And she wrote something I found so profound. She says, as we head into Shabbos, a time when we look more outwardly a glimmer of understanding begins to dawn. Words are not going to do it. Words can't contain this event. They can't console. They can't clarify. So our words are out. But deeds, now that's a different story. Shabbos is about to begin here in Sydney. But for those in the rest of the world, the message is getting through. The New South Wales government itself put up a site to do mitzvahs in honor of the victims. Go back and read that sentence again. Pinch yourself. No, you aren't dreaming. You read that right. www.nsw.gov.au/one mitzvah. My friends, that's messianic. It's never happened before. That a government of a Western country, of a major country, is helping us, encouraging us to do mitzvahs. It's extraordinary. Last night, when the last candle of the Menorah was finally lit, my brethren returned to Bondi Beach. 20,000 Jews and their allies. 20,000 people gathered at the beach to kindle the menorah on the 8th night of Chanukah, Tavshin Pei Vav, 5786. And I ask myself, since the time of the Beis HaMikdash, since the birth of Chanukah nearly 2 millennia ago, has it ever happened that the menorah was lit before 20,000 people? Menorah lightings this year didn't double. Their attendance was triple and quadruple, and maybe more so. And people knew that there was a danger, an inherent danger attached to it. I can only speak for myself. I live here in the city of Toronto, and people have been saying all kinds of frightening things, drawing similarities between Sydney and Toronto. It really isn't very far apart. We have the same miserable failings at a federal level. Just south of us in the city of Toronto itself, the same miserable failings of law enforcement, the same hate marches, the same angry, disgusting, despicable lies and libels against the Jewish people. Some of them promoted by the official channels of members of the federal government and the Prime Minister's cabinet. Some even mouthed by the Prime Minister himself. We know what this does. It dehumanizes the Jewish people. It normalizes anti-Semitism. Because when leaders are hesitant, hate encroaches. And yet, right here in this city, where there have been hate marches through the streets of our own city and Jewish neighborhoods, hundreds and sometimes thousands came out to participate in a loud, in a proud, in an undaunted, courageous way. Truly, a most extraordinary Chanukah. My dear friends, there's something messianic about all of this. I'm not glossing over the pain and the suffering, chas v'shalom. Hashem should comfort the bereaved and heal those who are wounded. I don't know how that community will ever be able to be whole again. But we cannot be defined by the trauma, and by the pain and by the suffering, or by the grief or sadness, because we have a job to do. And our job is not only during Chanukah, but it's to carry the light of the menorah forth into the days, the weeks, the months, and the year that follows. I pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that out of the great light, the great love, the great loyalty that we have seen throughout the world amongst members of Am Yisrael and many, many other good people who have come forward to embrace us and to tell us that we don't stand alone, that we should find the strength and the courage not simply to continue or to maintain the level of our Yiddishkeit and its outreach up until this point, but that we should be able to continue to go mechayel el choyel, from strength to strength. Chanukah's theme is Moisef HaHolech. We have to surge ahead. We have to pick up greater velocity, greater strength, greater energy. And hopefully, out of the light of this year's menorahs, we will merit to see the great light of Mashiach and an illumination that eradicates darkness and evil forever. A level of clarity and God consciousness that the world has never seen before, an ensuing peace and endless prosperity, happiness and fulfillment that all good people will know in its wake. May it be, b'meheira b'yameinu, speedily and in our days. Amen. Happy Chanukah for this afternoon and for all year long. Thank you for joining.